Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome once again to Skeptics in the Pub online. I'm Cleo from Winchester Skeptics, and I'll be your host for the evening. A particularly warm welcome to those of you joining us for the first time tonight. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. So when COVID put a stop to our regular monthly talks around the country, a number of us collaborated to move them online and weekly. We have a fantastically wide range of topics and speakers who all approach their subject from a rational, evidence-based point of view. During the talk, we'll be posting some links in the chat from time to time. They include how to ask a question in the Q&A, how to donate to our running costs, where to find Dean's books, and where to buy our wonderful skeptical apparel, like this gorgeous top I'm wearing. And we also have face masks and mugs. If you're watching full screen, links to the Q&A and donations will also be at the bottom of the screen from time to time. So, our speaker tonight is Dr. Dean Burnett, who'll be talking to us about the science of mental health. His talk will last something between 45 and 60 minutes, then we'll have a 15-minute break, followed by a Q&A. Dean is a neuroscientist, lecturer, author, blogger, podcaster, pundit, science communicator, comedian, and numerous other things, depending, apparently he says, on who's asking and what exactly they need. He's a full-time author now, but he was previously a psychiatry tutor and lecturer at Cardiff University, and he's still an honorary research associate at Cardiff Psychology School. He's also in the middle of a busy lecture tour, so we're lucky to have him tonight. So you may have first come across him through his Guardian column, Brain Flapping, or through one of his earlier books. And I have to mention that one of my favourite takeaways is from The Idiot Brain, and it's that mine isn't the only brain that overrules the sensible decisions I made earlier in the day. And this was the bit I confused myself about, because on top of all this, I'm going to claim Dean as one of our own. He used to run Cardiff Skeptics in the Pub. And for tonight's talk, he's canvassed us on our most hated tropes and cliches about mental health. So thank you all so much for your responses, which Dean's now going to address from a scientific point of view, with reference to his latest book, Psychological. Finally, we were hoping that Pickle might be making an appearance, but Pickle is apparently a very cat-like cat, so it will be entirely on his terms. And tonight, that really depends on whether he even feels like being around. So we'll hope he does. But please put your virtual hands together to give Dean a very warm Skeptics in the Pub online welcome. Over to you, Dean.
Thank you very much, Cleo. So yes, thank you all for tuning in, watching. I don't know what the phrase is when it's a live online talk, but here we are anyway. So, yes, first off, apologies. I know some of you are pretty much only here to see a live glimpse of my cat Pickle, who I mention online occasionally. He's kind of notorious to the point where he now gets mentioned without me. He has outgrown me, has his own online presence, and I'm kind of redundant. So, sorry if you're here for the cat. He's usually in the exact same spot at 6:30 every day. I went to find it, but today he's not, because that's exactly the sort of thing he would do. So instead of cat, I'll try and find him in the interval, but instead of him, I'm going to talk about my book instead, which is almost as important. So this talk, or the series of talks I'm doing, is about Psychological, the book you can see on the screen, I hope. 2 words, very clever, I've always thought. And it's basically what it says on the tin. It's the science of mental health, because as someone who's been writing about it, covering it, addressing it, dealing with it, engaging with the subject of mental health in both professional and personal capacities for many, many years now. I do think it's an area which is kind of overlooked a lot, especially in the mainstream discourse, in that everyone has, a take on mental health, and rightly so, because everyone has it. It's not something that any one person can claim. But also, there's a big push for mental health awareness, but that, as good as that is, I often find there's a lack of understanding which comes to that. Like, it's basically saying mental health problems are real, which is the case, and little else. So, where do you go from there? And that is something I thought, well, there's not so much a gap in the market, but a necessary thing to correct, or I guess an oversight. So that's what I'm sort of doing with this book, is saying, yes, we all know or think these things about mental health, or we make these mistakes. So what does the science actually say? What do we know about it in the sort of the most rational, objective sense, the logical side of psychology, or psychological? See, I told you it was clever. So this talk is about that. And as Cleo said, I've canvassed members of the community to submit to their own personal bugbears when it comes to what people think about mental health, or the claims made about it, or the assumptions, or the misunderstandings, or just the general portrayal. and sort of model the talk to go through all those and see what the evidence actually says as to whether or not these things are legit, whether or not they have a basis in logic, or whether they are complete mistakes and harmful ones at that. It's a very rich tapestry. So I'm going to try and cover as much as I can in the time we've got. So before then, though, I like to start my talks like this with a few disclaimers, because I think that's important. As I said, and as most people who know me will know, I'm a neuroscientist. So all things come down to the brain with me. So I tend to focus on the brain, which I think is a logical perspective when it comes to mental health, because all mental health problems do stem from the brain in some capacity. But then you want to be particularly pedantic, so does everything. So every experience, everything we can perceive and sense and engage in and imagine and think of comes down to the brain. So it's a very broad area. But I tend to focus on the neurological and neuroscientific underpinnings of things, because that's my training. I obviously have an innate bias there. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Do not hammer brains. That's not something you're supposed to do. I learned that in the first year of study. So my perspective is a neuroscientific one. But also that means I'm not a specialist. I'm not a trained psychiatrist. I was a lecturer in the psychiatry program. So I covered all the bases. I put my fingers in every pie, dipped my toe in every pool, or whatever, any analogy you like, feel free to use it. But I think that can be helpful. And I think that can be a useful approach when it comes to the wider discussion about mental health, because it's not all one thing. There is no one sort of key aspect which explains everything. People specialize because they have to. Psychiatrists are specialists, clinical psychologists are specialists, various degrees of therapists specialize in a certain approach, a certain way of doing things, and that is a goal to the good. You need people who are skilled in this sort of area to deal with it, because it's so complex and so widespread and so causes so many problems. But when you're talking about it, it's always better to have a wider approach. So as someone who did a degree in neuroscience and a doctorate in neuroscience, and worked in a psychiatry program, but also studied in a psychology school, and worked in the media talking mental health, and worked in a medical school, I like to think I have a rather broad spectrum approach to mental health, and a lot of, maybe not the deepest insight, but I can come at it from various angles, which I think is helpful, because there's so much to it. It's the human mind. There's no real limit to it in terms of how it affects us. I'd like to mention that I'm not from a classically academic background, as anyone who has ever encountered me will definitely know. I do not sound like your typical academic, I'm told repeatedly, often with a face of horror. Happened my first day at The Guardian. I actually went down to sign some forms, and before then it had all been via email. So I turned up and said, "Hello, Dean, nice to meet you." "Hello, nice to meet you too." Then, "Oh, good Lord, that's what you sound like." It wasn't, they weren't unhappy, but it was like clearly weren't expecting it. But I think that gives a level of perhaps empathy, perhaps a level of appreciation for the wider context of mental health, because a lot of people from academic backgrounds are from rather well-to-do backgrounds. They have parents and family in the area. I'm from a very working class background, and the first member of my family to even do A levels, let alone anything beyond that. So I've grown up amongst people who are impoverished, who are working class, who don't have access to the best things. And I'm from Bridgend, and if those of you are old enough will remember the Bridgend suicide incidents in the early 2000s, and my family was deeply affected by that. And a lot of that stemmed from how it was covered by the media, which disgracefully, as it turns out. So I can offer, I hope, a certain level of empathy and engagement for that side of things too, rather than being purely clinical, purely objective. But that's my claim. You may disagree. And like I say, I'm going to say it again, mental health and any problem with it is an intensely subjective thing. It's not something you can look at. You can't dissect it. You cannot put someone under a microscope and say, "Oh, there's the depression germ that they've got." It's not that. It's a very subjective thing, to the point where I will say that people watching this are going to have had mental health problems of their own, or maybe deal with them right now. If that's the case, if you have a genuine clinical disorder, or you've been diagnosed with something, in many valid ways, you are more of an expert at this than I am, because I haven't had that yet. I have never got to the point where I needed professional help with my mental health. There's no shame in that, but it just hasn't happened to me yet. Could have happened. It may happen yet. Like, if those who follow me online will know, I lost my father to COVID early last year. I've had to grieve in complete isolation, alone. And it's been horrible, absolutely horrific. My mental health certainly has declined. It certainly has suffered. I haven't lost functionality yet. Maybe when everything goes back to normal and we are seeing each other more, maybe it'll hit me then. Maybe I will, spiral. I don't know. But thus far, it's not happened. So if it's happened to you, you have more insight than I do. So anything I say which is wrong, apologies. And just to really clarify it, this talk is about the underlying science, the methods, the perceptions, and so on of mental health. Now, there are problems with mental health care, how it's applied and how it's accessed and the resources available to it. And there are really big problems with that. They are all, these are all really valid concerns which really should be addressed. But I will say, at the risk of sounding, don't want to sound dismissive, but sounding a bit too perhaps aloof, these are problems of ideology, problems of application, problems of politics, just funding resource, or just people being horrible, because that's something humans do a lot. Not really a problem with the science. To make it a more sort of neutral example, British trains are often mocked for being unreliable, ridiculous, useless, but that's because they're managed badly. It's not because the physics of locomotion are flawed here. That's not how it works. So as valid as all these complaints about mental health care in this country and elsewhere are, I'm going to focus on the actual science as far as I can see and how it affects us. So that's a slightly different issue. It will come up now and again, but that's what I'm looking at. So here are some of the things. I couldn't get through everything because there were lots of submissions, and I really appreciate that. People have I've just picked the most common things that people have complained about when it comes to mental health, how it's portrayed in the wider world, how it's viewed, and how people behave regarding it towards around it. So the first one, perhaps an obvious to start with, the famous head clutcher. Now that's something people have complained about a lot. Anytime, but maybe less so these days, but for a very long time, anytime there was a story about mental health, particularly depression, but not just that, the accompanying photo in the media was this, what you see on screen. Someone looking distressed, their head in their hands, just like, just clutching their head. And it's grating. It's annoying because it's shorthand for mental health should look like this. And it doesn't. As anyone's had it will tell you, it's not necessarily about that at all. It conveys a sense of sadness, of suffering, of strife. And mental health problems are so much more diverse than that. Another thing which people brought up a lot was the fact that mental health is used as a term for so many different things, which are very, very different to each other. The only thing they have in common is that they're all affecting a facet of the mind. And yes, valid concern, valid point. But I think it's a useful umbrella term just so people know what we're talking about to begin with, because it's still not the most widely accepted thing, even though it's frightfully common everywhere in the world. So where did this head clutcher thing come from? I mean, it's an easy shorthand. You could say it's a lazy shorthand. Maybe that is the case. But it does sort of point to how so many mental health problems are intangible in that you can't see them. There is no physical presence they have in the world. Like I said, there's no depression germ. You can't have an anxiety tumor, or you don't break your psychosis gland or your bipolar bones. Like, these aren't things you can do, which is not quite the same with physical health problems. You can put a picture of a bacteria or like a tumor or an x-ray and stuff, and you can have, there's a visual element to physical health problems, which is often lacking in mental health ones. I mean, mental health ones have a physical element too, which I'll come to later, but in terms of, you look at it and go, oh, that's the problem. And that sort of leads to people in the mainstream media, perhaps before now, didn't know so much about mental health, or didn't know how to portray it, to find sort of a default or a stock image, and that's what the head clutcher comes from. Now, someone who's worked in the media myself, I will say I don't like it, but I can sort of see how it came about, because that's how people consume media. That's how people consume, visual things. That's how a visual element to be picked up by the search engines, by the algorithms. So you need something visual. That's how people's brains work. Like, a big block of text isn't something enticing. You need to have a visually stimulating thing. So once it's almost like it's like an agreed rule of thumb that, oh, this is what mental health problems look like, the head clutcher. But again, it doesn't help. It doesn't necessarily make things any easier to understand. It sort of gives the idea that mental health problems always manifest like this. It implies a sense of certainty, of reliability, which isn't the case. You can see someone going like this, you think, oh, they must have mental health problems, when they could just have an ice cream headache. Or you can see someone with mental health problems who isn't doing that, think, oh, they must be fine then. So those are extreme examples, perhaps. But I can see how it came about, but I can also see why it's a harmful thing. It smacks of how the brain works anyway. We don't like uncertainty. We don't like leaving things not pinned down. We need to categorize. We need to have some sort of structure to the world around us. That is an inherent trait of how human brains work, it seems. But the unfortunate side effect of that is that it's really hard to do that with mental health problems. That's why we have, this need for a diagnosis in so many people, or got to put people in the boxes. It's not necessarily a prejudice thing or dismissive thing. It's just how we work. We try to understand the world by putting it into some sort of recognizable pattern. And obviously people who work in the media cater to other people's needs and wants, and they will feed into that. Where you get these, sort of these visual tropes which represent mental health problems. They really oversimplify things, the wistful look out the mirror, just looking gloomily into the distance. Someone mentioned that every time in a soap opera someone has a mental breakdown, they always end up with a messy room. There's no sort of real connection between mental health problems and inability to tidy up. I mean, it's depression, you can lack the motivation, but it's not. That's not it's not a given at all. But it's a visual cue that something is different, something has gone wrong, and someone is not functioning in some way. And I can sort of understand where that comes from, but it is a particularly unhelpful oversimplification. It imposes expectations on how mental health stuff works, which aren't necessarily correct or valid. And that can cause problems when it comes to raising awareness. You're aware of mental health problems, but you're aware of the wrong stuff. Because the idea that everyone who has a mental health problem has essentially a headache, that's not helpful. That's not good. And it does lead into something else which brought up a lot: the questionable comparison of mental and physical health. So, when I say with mental health problems, we expect something to see. We expect people to see that something is wrong, because that's how we just develop. That's how we work. And with physical health problems, that's often the case, because the human body is very, very consistent. A heart murmur now probably felt the same as a heart murmur in Roman times. You get a cold now, the symptoms are the same as they would have been in the 1300s. Like an Egyptian stroke was probably felt the same as an ancient Egyptian stroke, probably felt the same as a modern day stroke. So we know what the body looks like. We know how it's meant to work, because we all have one. We all see them all the time. And we know when something's gone wrong. So if you meet a friend tomorrow, not that you can, but what I mean, when that's a thing you can do again, and they leak in green slime from every pore, you think that's not meant to be happening. That's not how bodies work. There is clearly something wrong with this person. They need help. And mental health problems don't necessarily have that element to it. They don't have this clearly, visible sign that something's gone amiss. And you could meet the same friend. Like last time we saw them, they were happy. Today they're miserable. They could be having a mood disorder or some sort of psychotic breakdown or something, but could have just had some bad news, just had a minor inconvenience. It looks the same from the outside. But this desire, this drive to express and understand mental health problems in the context of physical ones, it's a mixed blessing, or it's a double-edged sword, however you want to describe it, because people, with physical health problems, it makes people appreciate them. Like you see all those memes about going, like if we talked about physical problems like we do with mental ones, like don't want to just go for a jog when someone's got a broken leg, or every thought of thinking positively when someone's on chemo and things like that. Those are unhelpful approaches, definitely, and it's valid to point out that they don't work with mental health either. But also to say like mental health problems are the same as physical ones suggests that there's something to be fixed, something to you go in and address this concern, or there's a root cause which is biological in nature, and there might be a cure. These are all things which aren't necessarily helpful assumptions when it comes to mental health, because it's not how it works. It's not only about coping; it's about adapting. It's about management. We're finding like the root cause of the distress, not necessarily the actual physical problem. So these are all these things. I can see where the head clutter comes from. I can see why it became so common. But I can also see why people don't like it and why it should be phased out. I mean, I don't know what the alternative is. I mean, what is something which looks like a mental health problem that people can understand if they're not used to working with it at all? That's the question. And I guess that's something people can work on. But all the talk of the contrast between physical and mental health problems leads to another thing which a lot of people brought up. Stop stressing or you'll give yourself an ulcer. Or phrases like this. The idea that a negative mental experience, a negative emotional experience, can manifest in physical ways. Which does, these are things that can happen. And this highlights, as I say here, the actually very complex relationship between mental and physical ailments. Now, I said here on comparing physical and mental health problems. But that suggests it's a binary thing. There's one or the other, but they often have a lot of overlap, a lot of problems, a lot of physical issues can result in mental health problems. A lot of mental health problems have a lot of physical symptoms. There is so much comorbidity. It is not a binary system because the brain, for all else it is and can do, is an organ. It's a physical organ within your body. It depends on the body to function, to survive, and the body controls the brain. There's not like like neighbours just sharing a garden fence. They are very integrated systems. So when you are stressed, your body will react to that with all the chemicals you're putting out. And the evidence suggests now that stress, constant chronic stress, is a key factor in a lot of the most common mental health problems. Like in depression, it now believe that it sort of exhausts the relevant neurons for giving us the ability to change our mood. With anxiety, it sort of causes too much activity in the threat detection parts of the brain, like the amygdala, and they become overpowered and therefore constantly see threats and dangers when there isn't any. All to do with this constant low-level drip, drip, drip of stress. And that's where sort of people say, okay, you'll give you something else, sir. Yes, that's one physical symptom, but that's why so many mental health problems have physical symptoms on the side. If people say it's all in your head, that's not true. It's never been true. I mean, either everything's all in your head or nothing is. It's in every experience, like I say, happens within your brain, so it's in your head. It doesn't make it any less real from a subjective sense than an actual physical experience. But this also does reflect some of the more concerning aspects of the modern day discourse around mental health. So saying stop stressing or you give yourself an ulcer, inherently that logically assumes that physical problems are more of a concern. The stress itself is like, oh, everyone's stressed, but the ulcer, that's what you should be worried about. So it does elevate physical problems above mental ones. The stress itself should be enough of a concern. You should say, stop stressing. Not that you can say to someone, stop stressing, and they will. That's, again, it's another problem. But, it's, it harks back to the thing I said about if you have a mental health problem and expect it to be like a physical one, you are sort of prioritizing the wrong thing. The example I use in the book is like, yes, physical and mental health problems, insofar as they are separate things, have a lot of things in common. But it's also like comparing a frog and a dog. They have 4 legs. They are common in Britain. You see them around farms a lot. They can be pets. And they sound similar names. So there's a lot of comparisons between a frog and a dog. And I guess you could describe a frog as a small wet dog if you counted someone who had never seen a frog before, or even heard of the concept. So there are reasons to compare them. But then if you took a frog and then took it home and fed it dog biscuits and put it in a nice warm basket, you'd end up with a dead frog pretty quickly. Because as many similarities as there are, you can't ignore the differences too. Those are quite key. And to sort of always assume that your negative emotional state, don't mind that, it's the physical stuff you should be worried about, is unhelpful and can be more stressful, of course. And it sort of opens up an interesting avenue of what counts as valid therapy here. In that, this is a Skeptics in the Pub talk, so it's perhaps a dangerous ground to tread. If the problem is that you're feeling anxious, if that is a genuine symptom which is causing you to be unable to function in the modern day world, if it's causing such disruption to your mind that you cannot do what you should be doing, you cannot do what you want to be doing, you are unable to exist as you like, it's causing you genuinely debilitating. If something causes that anxiety to reduce, then it's a valid therapy. And that's where sort of the lines between regular medicine and alternative medicine break down a lot. When I worked in the psychiatry program, they would recommend things like aromatherapy or, like reflexology and things like that. Not because there's a genuine massive body of robust evidence to show that these things have a physical effect, but we're talking about a mental health problem. And if it makes people feel better, then technically it's a valid therapy. So when it comes to mental health care, so it does blur the line somewhat between alternative and regular medicine. And there are people who argue that the role of medicine in mental health is already kind of a bit draconian, a bit over the top, as we'll see soon. So that actually brings on to another thing, which people have brought up a lot. The phrase, let's get you off those pills. Now, I've heard that a lot. I've heard that from many different people, not to me, because I've never been on pills, as the colloquial phrase will have it. But I've heard people say, like, a personal trainer says to them, okay, first we need to do get you off your meds, because that's the goal. A personal trainer should never say that. If a personal trainer's qualified in psychiatry, fair enough, but they usually aren't. Hence, they're working as personal trainers, because it's a different discipline. Physical things, the physical health, which is fine, but I think the two can be linked. There is a link between physical and mental health, of course. The brain's an organ. So if you exercise more, the brain gets more resources because your body is just in better shape. That doesn't necessarily mean it'll be fixed. It can help, but it might make things worse. It might make your brain better at doing unhelpful things. So exercise can help, but if it doesn't help, you haven't done it wrong. It's just that whatever the underlying problem is, can it be fixed that way? Can it be addressed that way? So often it's a lazy shorthand, but that's a whole other thing. Like I say here, it's this idea that you have to get off your pills. I mean, even The Guardian a while back, they had an article which is generally quite good about antidepressants, but the first phrase in it said, antidepressants were never meant to be a long-term medication. Antidepressants were never meant to be anything. They were discovered by accident. They were looking at medications for things like surgical shock when you're recovering from surgery, and they found one cohort of patients, like, notice these guys' moods seem to be elevated a bit. That's odd, isn't it? What's going on there? Like, antidepressants were discovered by accident, and well, these are helpful. Let's churn these out. So the idea of them being long-term or short-term wasn't really considered from the off. To make sure they were safe for long-term use, and by that sort of testing. But this idea that you definitely shouldn't be taking pills or taking medication is potentially a dangerous one. So it's a tricky one to get the balance right. But as I see it, stopping medication, being able to function without any medication, without any external therapeutic interventions at all, that's obviously a helpful goal. If you can just sustain yourself and function and be alert and work using all just your own internal systems, that's obviously a good goal. That's the default norm people aim for. Fine, fair enough. But it's a very dangerous default to assume that as soon as you're on meds, the first thing you should do is get off them at the first available opportunity. That is a very dangerous assumption, because a lot of people need long-term medication. They do need to have the regular input of antidepressants. That's also I'll explain soon. The idea that just because you're not depressed means you should stop taking your medication, that's not necessarily how it works. It's like I'm not having it's a common example, but I'm not having a low blood sugar now, so I don't need my insulin. It was like, no, you need to keep it, you need to preempt it, and that's a lot of time. That is how it works there. So this idea that you shouldn't take pills, especially not mental health pills, because they are somehow worse, somehow just inherently bad or wrong in some way. Happy pills, people dismiss them out. There's a lot of pill shaming. The idea that if you need pills to cope with your mental health, then you are flawed in some way. You are doing something wrong, or something which should be stopped. Or, you should be guilty about it. This is all bad. It's all wrong and all very unhelpful, because you need to do whatever you need to do to maintain an even keel, to make your mind work, make your brain work as it should. If it's not doing that by itself, then it needs some external help, because we have medicine now. That's why we do these things. We don't live in a dog-eat-dog world. We don't live in some sort of tribal society where the weak get slaughtered for their resources. This isn't how we operate. And yes, you can say that other interventions, like non-pharmaceutical ones, may be better and safer, more healthy, or however you want to describe it. But that sometimes you just can't have it like that. Sometimes they're not viable. Like if you go to a doctor and say, I'm having serious depressive issues. No, this is a GP with a 50-minute appointment, and they can either say you need 6 weeks of intensive therapy with a counsellor who's got an 18-month waiting list, or you can have this box of pills now. A lot of the time it comes down to circumstance and just what people have to hand. So there is perhaps an over-reliance on antidepressants, but that's not necessarily indicative of some sort of wider flaw with the medication or some sort of sinister conspiracy. It's because that's the situation we find ourselves in. But speaking of, let's get to that. So antidepressants themselves. I want to have a drink of water quickly. So antidepressants, like when people say pills for mental health, they invariably mean antidepressants. Like that's the go-to medication for mental health issues at all. Because depression is the most common mental health problem, as far as we can tell. Something like 350 million people in the world have it at any one time, which is a lot. Several small countries, so one big one, I guess. I don't know why I've said several small ones. Countries vary. And antidepressants are the go-to treatment. And they're often stigmatized unfairly. And in a way, you could argue, and as I have done, that it's actually a sign that the campaigns to raise mental health awareness are actually working. Because when I started writing about mental health, we're talking 10 years ago now, just over that, it was still very common to see articles from your usual provocateurs, your punditry and your attention seekers saying there's no such thing as mental health problems, or dismissing the concept outright. We haven't come a great deal, but you don't see that so much now. Now it's sort of like, depression is a thing, but antidepressants aren't really helpful. You don't need them. That's the more common argument I see now, and that sort of suggests that we have moved somewhere, in the right direction. But now antidepressants are taking the brunt of the assumptions, the stereotypes, the knee-jerk reactions. So, what is it about antidepressants which cause this, negative press they get a lot? Well, it's an easy target because it's so common and everything like that. And like I said, that's often a result of circumstance and of resources and things, not necessarily because doctors want everyone on medication all the time. You can argue that pharmaceutical companies have an input to be able to get to that. But so antidepressants, how do they work? Typically, they work by increasing the levels of neurotransmitters that are reduced in the depressed brain, hence the chemical imbalance model. So as seen a while ago, like when they discovered antidepressants, they realized that what they do is they boost levels of certain neurotransmitters, the chemicals which allow neurons, brain cells, to communicate with each other across the synapse. And for some reason in depressed people, you've realized that they have fewer or lower levels of the necessary antidepressants to do the normal function of the brain, and antidepressants reinstate these levels, they bring them back up again. So that's where you get this idea that depression and mental health problems are all a chemical imbalance in the brain. But a lot of problems with this argument, actually, and as anyone who knows the science now know that chemical imbalance, it's still is an element of that, but that is by no means the full story, and it's sort of become quite an old-fashioned and outdated model of how mental health and depression works now. For example, like there's lots of problems with this argument. Antidepressants, they take several weeks to have therapeutic effects, as anyone who's taken them will know. They take 2 to 3 weeks to kick in and stop you feeling as depressed. Pardon me, but on the chemical level, they work right away. Once you swallow an antidepressant, it's mere minutes before the levels of chemicals in your brain are sort of boosted, brought up to about more normal levels. So if it was just a case of, I'm going to have neurotransmitters, they should start working right away. But they don't. So clearly something else is going on there. And we know that's the case because antidepressants have a lot of side effects, because when you take a drug like that, you're elevating the chemical levels throughout the brain, not just in the one part you need to increase the levels. Everywhere which uses those neurotransmitters is now experiencing more of them. And that has consequences, because the brain uses a lot of these chemicals for lots of different things. And so you have antidepressants with many different side effects, but they tend to kick in right away, but not the therapeutic effects, which is just grossly unfair when someone's already got a depressive disorder. And you're never sure how well they're going to work, because they might not work at all, or they might even make things worse, because every brain is different and is developed differently and has different internal workings, different chemical balances. There's no blueprint brain which everyone has with a few tweaks here and there. Our brains are the result of our development, our genetics, our upbringing, our diet, our environment. So every brain is radically different in many particular ways. And sometimes you can have people who will react badly to antidepressants, someone will react really well to it. Like it was recently discovered, the serotonin system. The most common default antidepressant are SSRIs, Prozac, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They boost serotonin levels. It was only recently discovered that the human brain has more than one serotonin system. It's all one big network. It's actually, no, there's 2 networks here. This one does this one does that. And maybe one's more powerful than the other. Maybe one's balanced. But this one actually makes you feel worse if you boost serotonin. So therefore you get people with really bad reactions to these very common drugs. So there's lots of going on in the brain which sort of gets in the way of antidepressants working as you'd hope they would. So modern science, so the latest we've got, there's a neuroplasticity mechanism of depression now which can help explain this. So this argues that, the evidence suggests even, it's plenty of data to show this does actually tend to work. And there are other theories of depression, by the way. I want to point that out. There's the inflammation theory, there's the cognitive theories, which says nothing to do with the physiology, it's all to do with how it's processed in the mind. And there's our theories that it's an evolved response, it's meant to be happening. These are all interesting and valid theories out there, but this is one I go to because, like I say, I'm a neuroscientist, I tend to like this stuff. So it's argued that because of the prolonged stress that modern life often inflicts on us via various avenues, the neurological mechanisms, the networks which help control and regulate mood, they become exhausted because stress constantly causes changes in mood and things like that. And when you use a neuron too much, the activity of neurons is very physiologically demanding. The brain uses up like a third of the body's energy supplies, ready energy supplies, just staying alive. So it's a really hungry, demanding organ. So it means it's doing a lot of work. And the stress, constant stress, means like the parts of the brain which control mood become exhausted. They sort of enter a sort of shutdown is perhaps too strong, but a sort of hibernation phase, or they're just like doing the bare minimum on standby. Let's go with that. And therefore, they can't change and adapt to external stimuli like most neurons can and do. And this is what leads to depression. Because if you look at the actual criteria for depression, yes, the low mood is a very common and persistent part of it. But it's the fact that it endures. The fact people stay in this low mood for 2 weeks minimum. That's sort of like the more important criteria for depression, because people have low moods all the time, as everyone will tell you, like, oh, I've been depressed. You haven't. You've had a low mood, or you've been depressed but not clinically depressed. We need different words for these things. So you have people who will say that, but moods tend to change because things happen all the time. There's lots of things going on, but when it's very weird to have a persistent mood, low or high, which sticks and doesn't change for weeks on end. And that's when this isn't meant to be happening. So that's what we believe is one of the more root causes of depression now: exhausted neurons, which are unable to change your mood. And if they're exhausted, they put out less neurotransmitters, and therefore you have depleted chemical levels. So most go-to antidepressants work on neurotransmitters as part of the monoamine class and associated neurons. They're very important, but dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, but they occupy a relatively small component of the brain. They're like sort of like the threads, like the veins in marble. They're everywhere, but they're not much of the whole. And as a result, the action they have is sort of widely dispersed or sort of subtle. So you can take these antidepressants and they boost activity and coax these neurons back to life gradually via the monoamine system. But now we have newer antidepressants being studied now, like ketamine and psychotropics, which are much more potent and seem to be much more effective. I'm not saying you should go and take ketamine if you're depressed, because it's still been highly researched and is a very, very, very potent chemical. But it works on glutamate, which is 90% of the brain's activity is glutamate-based on current models. So it kicks in much faster and right away. Like the newest ketamine antidepressants, which are still being trialed, but they seem to kick in within hours or maybe next day at the latest, which shows that there's clearly something a bit more potent in something which works on glutamate. And it also explains how combining therapies, which seems to be the best approach for depression, combining antidepressants with cognitive behavioral therapies, these seem to work a lot better. So antidepressants boost the activity in the neurons, and the cognitive behavioral therapies, which by and large coach you to think in different ways or avoid negative thought patterns, they sort of take that newly raised activity and shape it better, so it's in a more helpful and healthy arrangement in your brain and your general thoughts. So this is the more details of antidepressants. So this idea that you just take a pill and get happy again is far from the truth, and they are far more complex and nuanced and subtle than that. This idea you have to get off them isn't necessarily, I can see where it comes from. They're not the most pleasant thing. No one enjoys taking antidepressants that I'm aware of, but they also can be lifesavers. They can be really essential. They can bring the people back up to this level of activity. And once your brain's gone into a depressive state, and those cells are still kind of vulnerable, so keeping them ticking over with regular antidepressants can be the best approach. So rather than let them fight or flight, or let them sort of just live or die on their own means, you keep them sort of topped up. And that can be a very helpful approach. It means you should take your medication for as long as you physically need to. But again, that depends on what happens afterwards. But that leads to another thing which people are concerned about: over-medicalization. Labeling of normal expressions of humanity or mental expression as medical problems. Genuinely something to worry about. Of course, we should be watchful of the idea that any sort of deviation from the norms of humanity is actually a medical problem to be stamped out. People are diverse, and that's a big part of our strength. In a way, it's a similar concern to pill shaming. It's a sort of way of saying there's nothing wrong with these people. They shouldn't be on medication. But it seems a lot more morally valid approach to say this person is having a hard time because life is like that. You shouldn't just then pump them full of meds to stop that happening. It's okay. The concerns are genuine. So one thing which people seem to overlook a lot, especially in the mainstream, is that negative emotions are necessary. Without negative emotions, our brains cannot experience, kind of process negative aversive stimuli. It's an important part of who we are. It's an example I use, like trying to suppress negative emotions and only experiencing happy ones. It's like going to the gym every day, but only working on your left leg. So at the end of the 3 months, you've got a really big left leg and one really spindly one. Then you're walking in circles, you're falling over, you look ridiculous. It's not a healthy approach to use. So I think part of this comes from like modern day capitalist, aspirational, first world stuff. Like, you should be happy all the time. The idea that if you're not happy, something is wrong. That isn't how brains work. Happiness is a reward state, which is meant to happen when something good has occurred. It's entirely possibly neutral. It's not meant to be the go-to, because it's an experience to encourage you to do something. Like, this was good, you're happy now, do that again sometime. Happy all the time, then nothing has any meaning. So don't be happy all the time. But yeah, it's really unhealthy to suggest that any negative emotion is to be stopped and suppressed. And obviously there's the corporate angle too, which I know the ultimate practitioners will be very keen to cry big pharma, but it is a concern, especially in the American system, where the pharmaceutical companies have a big say in how healthcare works, and they are profit driven, and the more disorders there are, the more money they make from selling expensive drugs. So there is actually concern to be had there. But on the flip side, there are a lot of arguments for most mental health practitioners do at least mean well. People in charge, at least where their eventual actions, they do what they do to try and be helpful. And so there's a lot of ideology involved. There's plenty of people out there, even trained psychologists, who insist that mental health cannot go wrong. There's no such thing as a mental health disorder, because everything people experience is a valid reaction by a natural human brain, and it's just society which has the problem, which doesn't allow these people to exist in this form. And yeah, you could argue there's a case for that, but I don't personally buy it, because again, I'm a neuroscientist, and that's like telling me the brain cannot go wrong. It really can. Trust me, it's really good at that. But some of the examples of over-medicalization people often refer to as things like grief and tantrums. Now, grief, trust me, I know of experience, is a very unpleasant experience, and it's a horrible thing to go through. But there's a difference between normal grief and pathological grief. People genuinely cannot cope. They break down. They have, the emotions are too powerful. So some intervention is potentially needed there. And there's also a big fuss about tantrums, or children tantrum being labelled as a specific mental disorder. Obviously, with children involved, people are more concerned. But that actually was a thing that was introduced into the diagnostic system, because before then, children who were having chronic tantrums and constantly having completely unmanageable behaviour were being diagnosed with bipolar disorder and then being put on far more powerful medication. So the tantrum disorder means, actually, it's like a lesser of two evils. Like, we don't want to give you disorder, but you have this one. It's much milder. You don't need such potent drugs in your system when you're a child. So sometimes they are good things. You could argue you shouldn't be diagnosed them at all, but that's a whole other thing. And this also leads to a more fundamental question, which I think a lot of people don't really consider about mental health, is like, at what point is someone officially mentally unwell? When can you say someone goes from being mentally well to unwell? Where is that boundary? It's really tricky to pin down, because mental health has no physical, tangible norms to calibrate it from. You know what a body looks like. You know which way an elbow is meant to point. If it's pointed backwards, you think that elbow is wrong. Something's gone wrong. We need to fix that. Like I say, or if someone's skin turns purple, like, you aren't meant to be looking like that. We clearly need to look at what's going on there. It's a lot easier to do with physical stuff. Mental ones are much more intangible, much more difficult to qualify, to measure and assess. So there are a number of criteria used to identify a mental health problem. Is the individual statistically abnormal? Is what they're doing far enough of a deviation from the norm to be considered an issue? Like, that sort of depends on what the norms are. So, like, if you say someone regularly consumed a known poison which interfered with their faculties, you think, that's really unhelpful. You shouldn't do that. But no, if it's alcohol, that's perfectly normal. Someone talks to an invisible alien called Bobo that they think created the universe. Like, okay, that's weird. Keep an eye on that guy. But if they talk to God, that's great, and that's religious. If you do it long enough, he'll give you a big hat. And that's, so is it abnormal enough to be considered, okay, that's too far beyond the what we consider normal to be is ignored. As well as that, because obviously not everyone's unique in their own way, so it's a bit of a crude approach to identify mental health problems. Is what the person experiencing, are they experiencing stress or discomfort or pain? Is it making them feel worse in some way? Which a lot of non-mental health problems do, but is what they're experiencing causing them issues? So if it is, then there's obviously a problem there, which they want to have stopped, which is good, but also brings up the fact that a lot of people don't have the insight in that, when you have a mental health problem, one of the things which can be affected is your self-awareness, your appraisal of yourself, your ability to recognize that this is an issue. So if they don't have that sort of insight as to what's going on, are they behaving or thinking in ways which are maladaptive, objectively harmful to themselves or society or both? But if they're doing something or thinking something or behaving in ways which cause damage to them or the people around them, say, right, that's not meant to be happening. So we have these criteria, which we say, if something fits these criteria or fits all of them, then that's a mental disorder, clearly. Makes logical sense, yes? Technically, yes, but it's also worth mentioning this. Until the 1970s, homosexuality was listed as an official mental disorder. The medical organizations said, if you're gay, that's a mental illness. 50 years later, legal same-sex marriage is increasingly common. In the UK and the US, it's a thing now. If you're homosexual, you can get married. That's great. That's progress. But, at the time, homosexuality did meet the criteria. It is statistically abnormal. Most people aren't homosexual, so it meets that criteria. People who have homosexuality end up experiencing a lot of stress, a lot of unpleasant side effects and stuff. And if you believe that sex is for reproduction, then homosexual sex doesn't lead to reproduction. And therefore, you need reproduction to sustain society, so it's socially maladaptive. So it met the criteria for mental disorder, and then it didn't. Homosexuality never changed, though. It's been the same for thousands of years since humans first existed. Society changed, and our benchmarks on the normal changed with it. And this has a lot of huge implications for diagnosis, and it's still an issue today. Why people don't like to use the word mental illness much nowadays. So you don't see it as often as mental disorder or something a bit more neutral. Illness is a value judgment. If someone's ill, you say something is wrong with them. That's how most people accept it. But in the 70s, said someone who was homosexual was mentally ill, they weren't. But there were efforts were made to fix the problem, the illness. And that caused more problems, more harm. So the argument is, what are we saying that now is an illness, which could be, in 10, 15 years time, think, actually, got that wrong. And, so we don't have physiological norms for comparing like we do with physical health problems. We have to use social ones and psychological ones, which are far more in flux. So basing your diagnosis on social norms, it can be more in your boat by tying it to a cow. Big, solid, heavy object, but it could just wander off. Then you end up somewhere completely different, and you didn't want to be there. And that is a problem with mental health disorders. Obviously, scientists are aware of this. They're trying to take this into account. So where would you find these criteria, these mental health problems? The most obvious sources are the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders from the American Psychological Association, or the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, which is produced by the WHO, the World Health Organization, who are more famous these days for various reasons. It is, it's an issue as well. These are the big lists of every type of mental health problem that is recognized by clinical sciences. And that is fine. It's good to have that all in one place. And these are the things which homosexuality was removed from in the 70s. This is listed in these as mental health problems before. So there's lots of different advantages to each type. The APA one is, the DSM is by the American Psychological Association and focuses solely on mental health problems, whereas the ACD looks at all health problems with a subsection, but it's also a non-profit organization, whereas the APA is for pharmaceutical funding. So, there's lots of issues there. But if you want to know where mental health problems are written down, it's here in these places. Which brings up, lots of people have brought up the ideology and prejudice in mental health. I know I said I wasn't going to dwell on this, but it is an issue which comes up a lot. Gender, race, the diagnosis you have, the role you have in the process, these can easily impact on the healthcare you receive when you express a mental health problem. The obvious example is that women were historically deemed more mentally unstable. Hysteria is a feminine term. It's believed mental health problems, it was believed, not anymore, thank God, the mental health problems occurred when the womb detached and went wandering through the body, causing disruption. Internal organs don't do that. They never have done. That was a ridiculous thing. But then I realised actually men are quite prone to this sort of problem too. And the doctors apparently updated the system saying it can happen to women or men with flabby testicles. That's kind of like a womb. Science was not in a good place back then. Or things like nymphomania. I think we've all heard the term nymphomania. It's hypersexual. That's what we call it these days. It's an old term. We don't use it anymore. But hypersexual nymphomania only ever applied to women. Satyrisis was the male term. A man who wants too much sex. But, that never caught on. Because a woman who wants lots of sex, that's just obscene. That never happened. She must be really ill. A man who wants lots of sex, that's Thursday. That's completely, the diagnosis and how they were used was shaped by social expectations and norms. And, women bore the brunt of this for a lot of time because they had less power and less authority in society, and had more lobotomies and things because there's more control over their lives. And then, men suffer for this too. This idea that men cannot show weakness, cannot be allowed to admit to being mentally unwell. The biggest killer of men under 35 is suicide, and that can't be a coincidence that men are told to be strong all the time, but not strong as in lift heavy objects or fight bears. It's be emotionally closed off. Do not express weakness at all of any sort. And that's really unhealthy. It's really, really healthy and damaging. And race and culture and background have negative impacts too. Like there's a recent promise to update the Mental Health Act to incorporate the fact that people who are non-white get a lot more harsh diagnoses and a lot less respect and trust. And people who are white get little enough of that as it is. And also, in the professional side of things, even purely on the people who are administering healthcare, you have a lot of turf wars and butting heads. Like psychiatrists and psychologists often come into conflict over things. And that's not necessarily a mental health thing. That's like a human thing. If you ever had a baby in the NHS, you'll know that midwives and the doctors do not see eye to eye a lot of the time and are quite vocal about it when it happens. When you have a hierarchy, you have people contributing in different things, that will just happen. That's people for you. Doesn't mean those on the receiving end have any sort of a better time with it, though. So we're hopefully making progress. Things a lot better than they were, but there's still a long way to go in that regard. And mental health and affluence and poverty. Now, people have mentioned this a lot too, that yes, your mental health and how it goes wrong is perceived very differently depending on your social status. It's a classic trope. If you're from a wealthier background, you're not, you get a much easier time with it. You're not mad, you're eccentric, like, Uncle Cuthbert with his old eccentricities. It's like, that's, if it was a more poorer person, they wouldn't have that sort of leeway. And it can work the other way. People often say, what have you got to be depressed about? Your life is great, from the outside perspective. That isn't how the brain works, though. The brain is not objective like that. So if you sort of look around and say, my life is actually objectively much better than 90% of the human race is, because I live in a developed nation and I have a secure income. That's not how the brain does that. The brain, it's a far more subjective thing, like I said. So your baseline is what you expect. So if your life works this way, like you have this level of comfort, your brain goes, right, this is my norm. This is what I should expect. This is how life works for me. And when you can have something go wrong there, when your quality of life declines, that will cause you stress, which is a big underlying cause of a lot of mental health problems. Now, that drop in general life standards may still be well above someone who's from a much more impoverished background, but it still causes you the same amount of personal harm or personal damage is the wrong term. It has that same level of negative effect on you. It's a subjective change, not an objective one. And a lot of it's down to the instinctive self-preservation bias of the brain. Like we see wealthier people and think, oh, their lives are great, I want that. And then we see them sort of suffering and think, oh, that's bad. I mean, that means they're not immune to it. But they're fine because they're wealthy, like I want to be. There's nothing really wrong with them. It's just a bit of fun. It's a bit of harmless eccentricity. And also we have an innate desire to sort of blame those below us for their own situation, because the fact is, it could happen to us. We could end up impoverished quite easily. And when I think the people there deserve it, because that means it's not us, we are better than that. It won't happen to us. It's a protective mechanism. And it's reinforced by many layers of society. Those at the top have a lot more power and can control the narrative a lot more. So you get this stark divide between how people are perceived in terms of their mental health when it comes to where they are in society. Like someone who lives in a bed sit or like a sort of a squat and takes a lot of drugs is a junkie, is scummy. Like, oof. Someone who's daddy got them a job in the stock market, who's putting away 20 lines of coke a night in a nightclub. Or he's just a high flyer. He's a maverick. He's living life to his fullest. And very, very similar problems, very different attitudes towards them. Which brings us on to the final thing. A little bit OCD. That's quote comes up a lot, which I think is very annoying. It's very potentially harmful, and maybe it's the downside of too much awareness. Increased awareness is great, but does not without negative consequences. Like a little bit OCD, the idea that you can have a small smattering of a very serious mental health problem, and that justifies your socially negative qualities, perhaps. It's something that happens a lot more these days. People will say, I do something which other people don't necessarily like. You could just own up and say, I'm fussy, or I'm a control freak, or I'm a perfectionist, or so on and so on. Or I can say I've got a bit of mental health problems. That gets me off the hook. It's like being used to get out of jail free card to not analyse yourself or find yourself wanting. And that diminishes the genuine problems people have, and it stigmatises them. Then all my negative traits, that's because of a mental disorder I don't have. So anyone else has a mental disorder is as bad as me. And it may not be meant that way, but it is something which can happen. And these things are a problem. Armchair diagnosis as well. People will sort of think now, because they know the terms mental health awareness, they can just say, oh, I saw him look like this on a newsreel once, and he's definitely got Asperger's, or he's definitely got chronic bipolar disorder. You don't know. If people who are trained to diagnose patients, they spend ages doing it. They take a big, long, extensive history, taking all the different parts of their life into account, and even then you can still get it quite readily wrong. So seeing it from a few tweets is not going to be good enough. But the idea that anyone can do it and anyone should do it, again, potentially quite a harmful one. And it's co-opted for cynical ends. There's mindfulness products, resilience training, toxic positivity, things I've talked about plenty of times, bandwagons. But this idea that mental health, because everyone is aware of it now, not everyone is, but there's so much more awareness, people will co-opt it for profit, for attention. They're like, I'm just having a me day and things. So these can be valid, but a lot of the time it's people who have otherwise comfortable existences and just wanted to be part of the conversation, which is fair enough. But it's one of those things, like if everyone's got the same thing, then nobody has really. And the idea that everyone's in the same boat isn't necessarily a helpful one when it comes to mental health problems. And lots of people have very serious issues which should be given more time, attention, and resources. But then it kind of distracts from that to keep saying, "Oh, we've all had that. We've all got this," and that it can be a downside of a bit too much awareness. So with that in mind, I should probably stop talking, because don't want to raise awareness anymore. So that's a page of my links. I think it's interval time, so I get something to drink, and then I'll answer some questions if there are any.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. The chat has been going mad with discussions specifically about what you were talking about. You've raised so many thoughts, and I think some of the things that people were talking about in the chat, they're going to put through to questions for you. So we'll pick up on all that later. So next week we've got Dr. Emma Chapman, and she's going to be talking about first light, switching on stars at the dawn of time. So from inside people to outside in the cosmos. I told you we had a wide range of things. But now we're going to have a short break, but hang around for the Q&A. Don't forget, if you want to ask a question, go to sitp.online/ask, and you can upvote the questions there that you'd like to hear answered. So we're going to meet back at 8:10, so refresh your glasses, go to the loo, and we'll see you soon. Welcome back. I hope your glasses are full and your bladders are empty, and you've come back to hear more of Dean's words of wisdom. I'm going to ask Dean some questions, and you've given us some excellent questions to look at, and then we'll keep going for a bit. So Starting off with a question here from John Bray. He's asked, has mental health got worse in the last couple of decades, or is it just that society is more inclined to label certain behaviours as mental illness?
I think it's one of those, like, there's no one specific answer to that, in that, yeah, we are seeing more levels of depression, anxiety. They seem to be going up, but you could argue that, well, so are the number of people. There are more people in the world than there were 50 years ago. So you will get, given the whole 1 in 4 stat, which is contested, but it's still a lot of people, you will get increased rates. And similarly, we are better at finding them now. We are better at recognising and diagnosing things because we have more set criteria, and we are, again, more aware that mental health problems are the thing. And we could argue it's similar, like we have more, based on what's happening right now, we have more photos from the surface of Mars like in the last 10, 15 years than we've ever had before. The Mars was always there. It's not a new thing. We didn't sort of go and make it. It's just that we have access to it now. And yeah, so I think the language has changed around it. The appreciation, the understanding, and the recognition of it is improving. As to whether it's actually, a genuine, tangible, relative increase in how many mental health problems there are, and it's hard to say because, in the last 70 years, we had global war, and that caused a lot of mental health problems, which, if you read Spike Milligan's autobiographies, which I always recommend people do just because they're funny, but he has a complete psychotic break and PTSD for his time on the front, and he ended up in a camp full of people they labelled bomb happies. Even in like World War II, there were countless examples of people having mental health problems, but they weren't really labelled as such. So yeah, it's a combination of all these things. It's maybe incidences are climbing the way. We live in such an aspirational society. We're constantly told that you have to do all these different things. You have to get a good education. You have to get a house. You have to, find someone, settle down, marry, have kids, have responsibilities, and you have to succeed in all these things. And in isolation, perhaps they're not too big an ask, but taken together, they are all massively, a massive pressure to have, and our brains are very inclined towards stressing. So, yeah, the modern world is more complex than it's ever been, and there's a lot more in it to be stressed about. Not necessarily which causes us problems, but we're aware of so much more, and the subsequent stress that can cause could be causing a notable increase in mental health problems. But it's going to be a combination of all those things. So, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say we're in the middle of a crisis of mental health, not yet. Maybe post-pandemic, who knows? But not a crisis in the spiking. It's a constant problem, but it has been for quite a while.
You've actually touched on the next question there, and can I ask you to expand a little bit and think about teenagers, because I think in teenagers we're seeing a lot more presentations, both in A&E and to mental health services, and that does tie in with the next question, which is how much of a mental health fallout do you anticipate from the pandemic? And do you think this will help with mental illness recognition and general support?
I think it's going to be a big one. I think most people I've spoken to have said, we are potentially on the verge of another pandemic of mental health problems rather than respiratory issues. And because it will have been stressful for everyone. We all went from having a great deal of control and freedom in our lives to having relatively none, and to having the constant stress of there being a genuine killer virus just in the air around us. And that's it's a recipe for massive stress, and people are isolated. Human contact is a really big part of humans and of the human brain. It's like we depend on it. We are the most social species by many measures. So yeah, there will be a big consequence. In terms of teenagers, I think in the early days of the pandemic, there was a lot of data which suggests that not that teenagers weren't feeling the consequences, but their levels weren't as there wasn't as big a change in the manifestation of mental health problems in teens as with other groups of the population. And you could argue that because adolescence is a particularly vulnerable time for mental health problems. You are, your brain's being essentially overhauled, it's maturing at the same time you're expected to do all this studying to make lifetime decisions. So you crave more freedom and autonomy, and society says you can't have it. You have to go to school, you have to live with your parents, and the benchmarks of your life, the relationship with your parents is constantly being changed and challenged. So there's a lot that happens during adolescence which causes us to be more stressed, and mental health vulnerability is increased. But there's some assessment says that the pandemic sort of removed a lot of that. Then when schools are closed down, teenagers didn't have to go get up early every morning, which is not really good for teenagers. Or the parents couldn't say, get off your phone, because there was no other way to talk to people. And there was no fear of missing out because nothing was happening. So there were some protective measures. But over time, when at a time in your life when you need to go out and to explore your own world, to push your boundaries, to develop autonomy, you genuinely can't do that now. That's going to have serious impacts, not necessarily permanent ones, because the brain's very adaptable, but it's going to take its toll. And there are some upsides, possibly, as in everyone's gone through this now, so everyone knows that will presumably have a better appreciation for being isolated, being cut off, being unable to access help and healthcare and things, and that's going to be something you can relate to now. I think in the future we'll see, it's like the phrase, it's like in the pandemic, when that'll probably be a more common thing people say when they want to sort of show or express how much people are struggling with stuff. And as inadequate a replacement as many people find it, this expansion in video communications could necessarily be a helpful thing for mental health, because if we see that as more of the norm now, then online therapies or doing it over Skype or remotely does take a lot of the pressure off. When someone's got a serious mental health problem, they want therapy, great, they have access to it, but it means leaving the house, traveling through town to go to that place and come back again, which is a really big ask when you're in the grips of anxiety or depression or any other potential illness. So maybe making this more the norm can at least take some of the pressure off that. So it's a mixed bag of things. Again, that's my usual answer to everything. It's a mixed bag. So I can never have to commit. Therefore, no one can tell me I'm wrong about stuff. It's a cop-out, don't get me wrong. I'm aware of it.
They're both, valid points both ways, though. There are swings and roundabouts to most things, aren't there? So,
well, absolutely, yeah. But especially with mental health, when it's all so subjective and variable. But it does mean I get to not commit a lot of the time, which is safe, I suppose.
One of the things that people were talking about in the chat, as it was relevant to what you were saying, were they talking about their own experiences with various mental health issues or supporting people. And Trevor Smith has asked the next question, which is, other than being there for them, is there anything a person can do if you're supporting a person with mental health problems?
It's a tricky one again, because how are we defining being there in this instance? Just like being around or being on the end of the phone? Great, but there are many different ways of being there. This is something I've experienced very recently with sort of the loss of my father and going through all that in isolation. In that, people, I got a lot of messages from people saying, "Oh, I just wish there's something I could do to help," and a lot of the time it made me genuinely quite angry, because obviously I was in a very emotionally disturbed place anyway. But from my perspective, it's like, you wish there's something you could do to help, but there isn't. You live 200 miles away, there's a pandemic on, there's nothing you can do. This message only makes you feel better, and I'm obliged now to sort of cater to you to maintain social norms. Screw you, how the hell? I never said any of that. That was occurred entirely within my head. I wasn't that far gone. But I did find it tricky to, even when people said, I can help you, I want to help, offering help to someone who's in a very low state is a very good thing to do. But the offer itself isn't enough. Like, for me personally, maybe it might be quite a male thing as well. I'd lost a parent, and I was stuck and I lost so much control of my life. The idea of then surrendering my autonomy, is in like, yes, I need you to do this for me, I need to do that. That was a big ask. It cost a lot to get to the point where I could say, yes, I would really like some help right now, because everything else had gone wrong. The pill had been kicked out of my life, but I was trapped at home. I had nothing else. But this idea that I was not in control of my own life anymore was upsetting. And there's someone to say, "Oh, just let me know if you need anything," that then put the pressure on me to say, actually, yes, I'm surrendering more control to you, who I'm not doubting your intentions at all, but that costs me to do that. So I would say that being there is fine. But say, call me if you need anything. I would say, if you can think of something to do, just do it. Something which would not necessarily, obviously don't redecorate the house, I'd ask them, or something like that. If you think I bet they need some shopping, I bet they need some food, I'll just take something round. Just take the initiative, I guess, is my recommendation there, because it's like, if it's already happened, I didn't ask you to do that, so it's on you, isn't it? So take the pressure off them to sort of ask for help if you have any way of being certain of what they need or want. Again, that's a big ask as well. That's a really big, it's a big decision to make. It's a big risk to say, I'm going to do this thing. It might work, it might not. But, it'll be appreciated more often than not, would be my expectation.
Yeah, so you're sort of saying, don't just turn up with a 3-course meal. They might not want it. But you can say, I've got some food. Can I bring it over? Would you like some?
Yeah, cool. I mean, you can phrase it like that. I'm doing you a favour.
Because there's one thing that you didn't say, which is also when somebody asks you what they can do, then suddenly it's your responsibility to think, well, yes, I need help, but I'll just do it myself.
Yeah, it's like, well, that's more for me to do then, isn't it? Yeah. So, let me know if you need anything. Do I have to? But then it's easier for me not to. Like, I'll cut out the middleman and do it. So, yeah, it's a weird. I hadn't experienced it before last year, but it's a weird thing. As in, I do need help, but I also need help in asking for help, which is, it's a strange. But then that's brains for you, isn't it? They are very weird.
Yeah. Cy Wonder asks the next question. What's the difference between neurological and psychiatric disorders? Like, why is schizophrenia psychiatric and Tourette's is neurological?
By and large, a neurological problem has a known cause, which is basically something going wrong physically in the brain. I think Tourette's has there's too much activity in this one particular area. Huntington's disease is a neurological disorder, so is Parkinson's disease. We know the part of the brain of the gene which is not doing what it should, or it's dying off, or it's being overexpressed. There's a root physical cause in the brain which we can point out and say that's what the problem is here. Like with dementia is a neurological disorder because we know large parts of the brain are atrophying and dying off. Psychiatric disorder, we don't know that. Like the brain's not necessarily doing anything particularly wrong, or you can't pin it on one certain area and say this bit has gone wrong, like it's been damaged in some way. Pardon me. It's more complex, more nuanced. It's too crude an analogy, but it sort of helps explain. It's like saying what's the difference between a hardware problem and a software problem. Like the neurological problem, something has gone physically wrong in the brain. With a psychiatric problem, the brain may be working fine, but it's doing wrong things. It's somehow developed to a point where it's doing this unhelpful stuff. And in a way, everything is obviously the cellular activity, everything's a physical thing in the brain, but in terms of being specifically able to isolate it, to locate it and say, oh, that's the thing that's going wrong here, then that's a neurological disorder, whereas with psychiatric, it need not be a root physical cause of the problem. I think that makes sense.
Well, we don't know it yet. I mean, psychiatry does treat neurological disorders like Tourette's and dementia are treated by psychiatrists, but it's complicated, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's a debate recently. Some got really sort of rate about calling dementia a mental health problem. In that, in the most objective way, yes, it's a neurological problem, but it has so many mental health consequences because it's a part of the brain a big part of the brain going wrong or dying off, and that'll have copious mental health. So, in a purely technical term, yes, it's a distinct thing, but in a practical term, there's not really much use in making that distinction if what you're dealing with is someone's mental health going into serious decline. So yeah, the root cause is almost not immaterial, but it's like that's not really the only thing we're concerned about.
Next question comes from Dave, the drummer, this is a big question. What's the status of CBT? And this is obviously from somebody who's not looked into these things for a long time. He said, I thought it was a bit woo, but I'm probably way out of date.
Yeah. Again, CBT is used by the NHS. It's a valid, known therapy, and it does have very practical and tangible benefits. It also has downsides too. It doesn't work for everyone. It can have negative consequences like any intervention can, but it's a real thing. I think some of the confusion lies that it is sort of sitting there and talking to someone. It's known as a talking therapy, but it's not just like tell me your problems. I think Hollywood stuff and the whole Freud image has a lot to answer for there. Someone just sat on a leather couch, just talking out loud, and someone writes it down and charges them £500. There's a lot more to it than that. It's a very specific and complex process, but it's root. It's sort of trying to coach people into thinking in ways that are different than normal ways, because the normal ways lead into these problems. It's like trying to sort of redirect the river or something. Or again, analogies. I've got loads, but not all of them work or not make any sense. But it does then overlap with things like mindfulness, which is a valid thing, but it's been co-opted so far and wide by people who want to sell a mindfulness colouring book. Because you know what, if you want a colouring book, have a colouring book. Don't just slap that label on it. It's fine if it helps you relax. You haven't got to call it mindfulness yoga apps, mindfulness car design. I don't know, but so CBT is a real thing, but it can be co-opted and used cynically. In that, a lot of people like in the NHS have complained that they're often given resilience training because it's a hard job, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of stressful environment. So it teach people how to deal with stress better, be resilient, and they can do more work, and then they do their work better. They don't get as affected by it, which makes sense. There's evidence to show it does work, but then that's often then treated as, well, now we've got a blank check to give our workers as much stress as they want because they've got resilience. Then you can handle 55 back-to-back night shifts. Your resilience training, no, you still need to change the underlying management. But so I think it's when these things are cynically co-opted to promote personal benefits, or to trying to make people sound better than they actually are. When employers give we have some cognitive apps for your stressful work environment thing, it becomes distorted because of how it's used by the wider world, often outside the medical field, but sometimes not. So
Can I just add to that about this CBT, because it's got such a big and quite a good evidence base. The difference I've seen with CBT done by CBT therapists and CBT done by psychologists, you've got a psychologist who's got the full, a deep knowledge and a rounded training and can spot when this is the right therapy and when it's not, compared to a CBT therapist who's like the hammer, looking for the nail. I have seen a big difference between who's the CBT therapist can be brilliant with the person who needs CBT, but you need a psychologist to say, actually, not quite right for this person.
Yeah, it's in the book, actually. A friend of mine who is a clinical psychologist, and how they compared it to psychiatrists, but I think it's the same thing here, as in CBT therapist has CBT, and this is what I can give you, this is what you need. And they say, well, a psychiatrist presented with someone with a mental health problem, it's like they're a chef and they have a recipe that they need to follow. So they're trying to find the ingredients in the person. So I think you've got depression, you have this, yes, see, you got that. Whereas clinical psychologists, they say, tell me what you've got, I'll see what I can make from that. As in, I'll see, if I'm the chef, what are the ingredients to hand? Right, what can we do with this? What does this tell me? What can I arrive at from there? And it's you can argue that's a better approach, but it's also kind of everyone gets a disease named after them. That's nice, but what do you do about it? Yeah,
there's the two sides, isn't it? There's finding out what's wrong, and because there might be something deeply wrong. And then what are we going to do about it? I mean, it might be a brain tumour in which you need someone to spot that, but then you need someone who's got the wider treatment options as well.
Yeah, well, it's always like a multidisciplinary approach is always the most beneficial, it seems, because you have people looking at different parts of the patient who is one complex whole. So, yeah.
Yes, I've always worked best with people who think so differently from me that we don't always get on. But you come to a much better conclusion in the end, and you do much better treatment.
You have more diverse trains of thought, so just approaching more options. So makes perfect sense.
So we've got a psych student next saying psychotherapy. Oh, yes, sorry, I like this. Psychotherapy can be pseudoscientific. He said Jungian, but any psychotherapy, isn't it? In its theory. However, it's probably the most prominent. What do you think about using unprovable therapies to support people?
Oh, yeah, that's, again, sounds like a cop-out answer, but it's going to be a case-by-case basis in that, what is the therapy? If there's no sort of obvious harm, there's always going to be potential harm, because obviously it's the human mind we're talking about. But I think it goes back to what I said about using alternative medicines for treating people. If it's something that makes them feel better, if it puts them in a better mental state than they were before, then arguably it does work. But then, of course, you got the problem of, you've told this person, I've given you some magic water or this enchanted smell box, and then you feel better. So then they are then inclined to think, so enchanted smell box is a thing now. I'll have that. I mean, I've made that up. I don't know if that's a real thing. It probably is, but I haven't encountered it.
I'd like an enchanted smell box.
Yes, like I hope it's not a euphemism or something. But yeah. So it's a really tricky one to argue because what is an unproven therapy? And every therapy is unproven at the start. I guess you gotta start somewhere. But yeah, again, case by case basis. What's the evidence base? How what's the potential logical mechanism of it? If it's got if you think, well, this makes sense because X, Y, Z plus X, Y, Z equals X, Y, Z squared, then all right, I'll sort of say, well, we should look into this, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I don't think just because that is kind of slippery slope there. Then well, nothing was proven at the start, so everything potentially works. No, it doesn't, does it? You can slap them a fish at midnight and say that'll cure your depression. You can't prove it doesn't work. I'm pretty sure it won't. But
and some of these psychotherapies have had plenty of time to show whether they work.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Yeah. It's like you haven't proven it doesn't work. You can't prove a negative, so it's yeah.
Where did we go? What do you think of this? All these questions, I'm sure you could do a whole talk on them. What do you think of transformative experiences and psychedelics?
Well, I think it's covered a part of that. It's in the book, definitely, as in it does seem to be, if you had to propose a mechanism, it does seem to come down to, in terms of depression at least, that part of the brain is exhausted. It's sort of it's become on standby. And these things sort of kickstart it. And a psychedelic, clearly a lot of your brain's been stimulated when you're seeing things which aren't really there or experience this intense euphoria or whatever it is. So it's clearly raising brain activity. And then the peripheral impact of that is going to sort of bring these sluggish neurons back into more normal firing patterns or more normal levels of activity. And that sort of seems to be the mechanism for the ketamine antidepressants, and the psychotropics like magic mushrooms are being looked into with a similar idea behind them. And people, I think there was a question I saw when I did a quick scan about ECT, like running that really powerful current through the brain. It does, it's a last resort. Definitely, you shouldn't do that just as a first choice treatment. But it does suggest that you're running a powerful current through the brain, then you're going to kickstart some sluggish things. I mean, if antidepressants, the normal ones, like sort of trying to bring a campfire back to life by lighting some kindling and blowing on it gently to try and coax it back into some sort of blaze, whereas ketamine psychotropics that is like dousing the petrol and just cranking open the flamethrower, we just booted it into high gear. So there's a mechanism behind it all, definitely.
Do you think we'll see things like ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin used as medication?
Well, this is the first trial of ketamine antidepressants was in the States in 2019, and I think it obviously got put back a bit because of the pandemic when medical resources were directed elsewhere. But it's a nasal spray, so not even a pill. You can't pill shame when it's a nasal spray. But like the evidence suggests, it does kick in very quickly, and it does have therapeutic effects in the first few hours or maybe the next day. So we are seeing that. They are really things that they're modelling on, and again, you have to be very careful because these things are Class A drugs for a reason. They are incredibly powerful and incredibly impactful on the brain's activity, and a lot of that won't be good if you don't do it right. So we are seeing that now. It's really quite encouraging.
So we'll just have to hope that the fact they are Class A's won't stop us being able to use them.
Well, I think it's only just recently they've allowed that to happen. As in, they've said, we'll sort of change the law so you can research these things, which means you can have them in your lab and you're not a dealer. So. Yeah.
You mentioned ECT, and actually someone has asked, how does it work? Do you have anything else to add to what you just said, the kickstart?
Well, it's a powerful current is run across the brain. I mean, it's got a very bad reputation, and it's not great. I mean, it does have a lot of really powerful effects, and not all those are good. But it's sort of like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest did for ECT what Jaws did for sharks. It didn't do them any favors whatsoever. This is bad. Everyone avoided it. Oh, thanks for that, marvelous. But it does seem to work in that it's known to have positive effects. It's like if this doesn't work, nothing's going to. That sort of approach to it. But it's very invasive. It's a powerful current. Is like run across the brain, a really sort of electroconvulsive therapy, the point where the brain sort of reboots, is sort of reset because this really powerful electric charges run across it. Done, of course, when someone's under anaesthetic and protectively, like so, if you did it when someone's conscious, I don't know what would happen. But so it's a very it's a very powerful but last resort because it's so powerful. Then if all else fails, let's try this. And that's how it should be used. Some people obviously will have different ideas about that, or some ideologies will go a bit further. That's a separate discussion. But that's the basic gist of it, anyway. Yeah.
So it can be magic, but it can also be quite dangerous. So be careful.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to people who get so used to being stressed, depressed, and anxious that it becomes their normal? How would you say that to them?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, I mentioned that depression, for a diagnosis of depression, you'd have the symptoms of really low mood or flat affect sustained for 2 weeks minimum. But in the DSM, I think both actually, depression, anxiety, you have to have high levels of anxiety for 6 months, which is a much bigger, obviously, body of time. But that shows that being anxious and being stressed is a normal part of everyday life, whereas being constantly depressed is not so much. Being fixed low mood, because like I said, there's so much in the world to stresses. I mean, you can say if you have a big project at work or you're planning a wedding, it's very common then to be in a state of some sort of low-level stress for 6 months, or longer, because these things take a lot of time. But that's logical stress. That stress has a root cause. You say, I'm stressed because I'm planning this wedding. I'm stressed because there's a big project at work and my job's on the line if it goes badly. I'm stressed because I've got a court case I'm dealing with constantly. These are all things which have a logical cause and they cause you stress. If your stress doesn't have an obvious cause, an obvious source, your stress is way beyond what you'd expect for something like this, then you might think, actually, this isn't normal, is it? This shouldn't be happening. And especially if it's debilitating to you, it's causing you serious issues and like that. So, yeah, it depends on what the cause of the stress is, I guess. So it can be pinned on something which is tangible and actually happening.
And it follows on, Paul Pitcure said, and I think this comes up when you're thinking about being in a state of chronic stress, really, are the physical ailments that are solely caused by mental health problems. So he says, are psychosomatic illnesses real?
Well, I'll say yes, but obviously that comes back to how are we defining real here? As in, any physical problem you have, the problem is when it's sort of how your brain interprets it, how it perceives. And a broken bone is only painful because the signals that are sent to your brain which encodes it, or when a nerve's sort of growing back or being repaired, that causes pain because the brain's going, that's not meant to be happening. I don't know what that is. I don't like that. So yeah, every psychosomatic illnesses may not have a root physical cause, but they can still be really problematic. I mean, Susan O'Sullivan has a book All in Your Head about that. It's quite interesting to look at sort of how they manifest. But you could look at something like eating disorders. I mean, there's no necessarily some roots of biological problem which leads to eating disorder, but they are real things, clearly, and they stem from psychological issues or concerns. I mean, what they are can vary wildly from person to person, but it's very rare. I don't think it's ever happened to you. Someone's caught like a bug and then had an eating disorder as a result. They are something to stem from psychological factors more than biological ones. So yeah, there are things. They're perhaps less common, but there definitely are issues where you have physical consequences to psychological issues. Yeah.
So Noodlemaz asks, how can we address ableism targeting mental ill health? So people love words about it, like insane, crazy, mad, batshit, etc. Can we get it to be taken more seriously?
I mean, hopefully we can. I think it's a sort of a problem now that these words have become part of the vernacular. Like in the book I wrote about the idea of what do we mean when we say disease, illness, sickness. So I looked it up when I was writing the book. Looked up illness. I think it was the Google dictionary, and I said illness, the experience of sickness. Okay, right. So look up sickness, like a period of being ill, like all right, so that's just circular reasoning. Like there's no underlying explanation there. And so again, I guess it depends how far we've gone now. I mean, I think when people say crazy these days, they don't mean mentally disturbed. They just mean someone behaving in an atypical way, which is kind of erratic and unpredictable. Does everyone mean that? I mean, how far does it go, I suppose? Like, I got one person having a go at me for my title of the book, The Idiot Brain, because that was, that actually means sort of a mentally disturbed person from like 200 years ago, so you should be ashamed of yourself. I don't think anyone, that's not how people use that word these days. So it's really hard to quantify, but like, how are some of these words like far too commonplace now to get that out there? And there's a discussion to be had about can we change the word around actual mental health problems? Like we say disorder now. People don't say like, oh look, that guy is really disordered. That's not the thing we say. So maybe over time we could get to a point where the words have become detached from the original meaning and we've got new words to replace them. But yeah, the book itself does go into a lot of things like words are important, but they're so flexible and so imprecise a lot of the time, and you need precision when you're talking about genuine medical problems, mental or otherwise. It's like trying to fix a watch with a rubber hammer. It's like it's a tool, but it's like that's not doing anything right, and that's sorry about the disgusting sound I made there. Because that was my impression of a rubber hammer hitting a watch. So apparently I've got that one. Hammer. Yeah. So yeah, it's really hard to say that one in that what has it got to the point where some of these words are not not meant in that way. Like intent's a big part of it, or like how far have we gone? How far how would we pull them back? So this is a very long-winded way of me saying I don't know really. So yeah, but I thought I'd give people their money's worth rather than just say that.
Your long-winded answers that come with a balance are always good. Justin Clarke's quoting another phrase here. Isn't everyone a little bit autistic? He said, that seems to me like the phrase is used to erase, deny, or otherwise invalidate the real lived experiences of autistic people.
Oh yeah, totally. That's the thing. It's like saying a little bit OCD is in. It's a lot of the time it's just a get out clause for people behaving in unpleasant ways. Like I was very cold to that person. I don't like to engage with you. I'm a little bit autistic. You're not. You're just antisocial. You're just unpleasant to be around. Don't be an arse about it. Like you don't. It's basically co-opting other people's issues and problems and genuine lived experiences to sort of avoid any responsibility for your own actions and behaviour. Like you can either say, well, I have this unpleasant habit. Perhaps I should do something about it, or say I'm a little bit autistic. Not my fault. I can't be blamed for that. And yeah, it's pretty much the same thing of just co-opting language around mental health problems, or like the very vague, very general understanding of how they work, and so use them for your own ends. And I know maybe some people do think they are a little bit autistic, but I strongly suspect they're not. But perhaps we need better understanding of how autism works. I mean, it's so often been used as like the bogeyman for so much stuff. The vaccine conspiracy was all about, the measles vaccine causes autism. Like it doesn't, and even if it does, is that such a bad thing? Like, why do you hate autistic people so much? Like my brother's autistic, and I wouldn't want him to die of measles because of what he is. That would be horrific. And yeah, so it's like it's such an uncertain and nebulous concept that people still haven't quite got their head around. So maybe that's the next awareness campaign that should be given the most attention. And explain like this is what autism is. This is how it works, and you don't have it. That would be a nice way to. Yeah. And
also some help for people who've got very severe autism, whose families just don't get enough support.
Yeah, even acknowledging the fact that women can get it, because that's been a very common problem until recently. Like I know a lot of women in their late 40s or something goes, I finally got an autism diagnosis. They always have been. Just it's like that's a man thing. You can't have that. And Simon Baron Cohen and his nonsense. But yes. So it's oh, there he is. Pickle.
Everyone's very keen to see Pickle.
Oh, here he comes. Hang on 1 second.
And we want to see your kitty has just jumped to the top of the questions. So I'm really hoping that
Thank you.
It's been explained to us by Dean that Pickle is as much cat as you can get cat. So
Pickle, hey everybody. Pickle, say hello.
Oh, he's gorgeous. Oh, look at his eyes.
Yeah, ouch. All right, fine.
That's quite enough cuddles, he says. Thank you very much. I can't see the chat now, but I'm imagining it's going completely overboard with.
Usually ends in bloodshed one way or the other. So
yes, there's going to be lots of pickle-related chat going on now.
Yes, of course there are. Yes, that really hurt. He does that a lot. He doesn't like. Well, he likes attention on his own terms. So, what was the question? Sorry, other than cat-related.
We'll move on to the next question. It's an anonymous one. Who says that trans people seeking support to transition in the UK have to have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Do you think we should abolish this diagnosis?
To be totally honest, I haven't looked into this that much yet because obviously it's an extremely hot button topic right now, and any expression or any comment about it is is like received very negatively by either side of the argument. I do. Again, it's like I haven't looked into it, so I don't want to make it a firm commitment as to one way or the other. But so I can understand how it can happen. I can, neuroscientifically, I think there are definitely means and ways which gender dysphoria can be a thing. But again, it could be that thing of like with homosexuality. Like, are we saying this is a problem now, and we're saying this is a problem now, which it won't be in a few years' time? I don't know. It could be. It's a contender. People make the comparisons all the time, totally. But I'm going to have to sort of say I don't know enough about that to make any firm comments. So I'm not going to invest in a fixed answer. So yes, I will look into it, but I haven't yet. So.
Okay, a few scientists speaking.
Well, thank you.
Are successful business leaders psychopaths?
Well, technically, I own my own company, so it's going fine. No, I know what I mean. Like, well, it's a common theory. Like, John Ronson wrote a book, his psychopath test was all about that a lot. It's. I mean, you can definitely see where that comes from, and there's definitely some arguments for it. But it's also kind of an easy narrative. It's in you have to be a psychopath to succeed in this world. Whereas, I think Ronson's investigation shows some of them do have psychopathic traits, but also some of them show completely atypical behavior for psychopaths. So I think people are more complex than that. You will have ruthless personalities. You'll have people with sociopathic tendencies, and so on. So too much soda stream. So it can happen. But yeah, I don't. Yes, but I don't think it's a given. It might be helpful in a sort of ruthless dog-eat-dog environment, which a lot of business becomes because of the whole testosterone thing. But I wouldn't say every successful business owner must be a psychopath, because people can be, I think that's worth mentioning, people can be very unpleasant without a mental health diagnosis. That's something I really want to really try to get out there. Is like when Trump first got elected, it's like, oh, he must have all these disorders, he must be narcissistic, he must be like, no, you can be an arsehole and have completely clean bill of mental health. That's very plausible. If anything, that's more common. So
you can just be a nasty bit of work.
Yes, exactly. I think that we should keep that in mind. You don't need a problem to be unpleasant.
And that brings us very nicely to Noodlemaz's next question, which is, I see a lot of armchair diagnoses of people, psychopaths, sociopaths, and while personality disorders obviously exist, are even the terms out of date or wrong?
I've had discussions about this. I mean, I think people I know who had diagnoses of a personality disorder or borderline, they don't like it because objectively it sounds like somebody there's something wrong with your personality, which means like you're a flawed or you're a bad person, which isn't that's not what it means, but it can sort of come across that way. I mean, there are antisocial personality disorders that are very overly represented in prisons and stuff, but I think there's something there to be looked at and to be investigated as to how to be treated and remedied. But yeah, maybe we could change the vocabulary around it, change the terminology to something else, to be a bit less loaded. What that would be, don't know yet, but maybe invent some new words. I think we do some new words. Let's try and concoct them.
Yeah, we'd like to know a bit more about why they happen in the first place, wouldn't we? Really?
Yeah, but this personality is very hard to pin down anyway. It's like I think I described it in my first book, The Brain, and said like I wrote about it, but I didn't want to, as in personality stuff. It's like trying to figure out the anatomy of a cat from the hairball it coughed up, because it's so far removed from the underlying stuff.
That is a lovely analogy. Ed asks, anxiety and depression seem to be different, but perhaps correlated conditions. Why are so many antidepressants also effective for anxiety? I mean, these two things, they can't be both the same and different, or can they?
I know there does seem to be an underlying mechanism which for both. I mean, anxiety and depression seem to have like a 30% comorbidity, as in nearly 1 in 3 people with anxiety will also have depression, and vice versa. It comes back to the stress thing, as in one mechanism which looks like, from the data I'm seeing, is that the chronic stress, which is something the brain hasn't really evolved to handle. I mean, insofar as the brain's evolved to do anything specific, it's like, it's given the way it's developed and evolved over millions of years, chronic long-term stress is a relatively new experience, because we've only recently, in evolutionary terms, acquired the ability to foresee things, to plan things, to anticipate and expect and imagine things going wrong. All of these things cause a stress response in our fundamental brainstem regions and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the network of regions which pumps out the stress chemicals into the body and which affect the brain and body. These are these regions. Stress is meant to be a short-lived thing. Stress is like the precursor to the fight or flight response. It's like getting your body and brain warmed up for dealing with something which is coming. And in the wild, that would be a predator or threat or some sort of danger or uncertain thing. But it's normally gone away within short space of time. It doesn't last for ages, worrying about the economy can, or worrying about global warming or climate change or the economic downturns, or is this company going to survive in the next 2 years, or what are your 5-year plans? And we can worry about things which have no physical danger for us, but which still have a negative consequence. Worry about them for very long periods, and they might never happen, or they might definitely have not happened. We can worry about, we cross the road, the car just misses us. We'll be stressed about that the rest of the day. Even though it's in the past, it literally didn't happen and now cannot happen. But we'll just sort of freak out about it, or we'll have counterfactual thinking. I could have done something different, and that worries us, but you didn't. It's all things, so we can worry about things which will never happen. And this causes constant stress, which our brains haven't really adapted or evolved to deal with in any particularly useful way. And that constant stress is what causes, or is believed to cause, the exhaustion of the neurons, which leads to depression. But also, it has a different effect on the threat detection system, because it keeps them working, keeps them ticking over, keeps them amplified. So then it makes it more like a muscle, which is constantly worked out, and then it gets stronger and more sensitive. And that throws off the balance between the conscious rational brain and the underlying suspicious brain, which is constantly on the lookout for threats and dangers. That becomes more powerful. So it's constantly seeing threats where there aren't any. So you have one part of the brain sluggish and worn out, controlling mood, and the other part frantic and worried and constantly looking for threats when there aren't any in anxiety. So you have a similar mechanism which applies to both anxiety and depression, which helps explain why antidepressants can work with anxiety. So there is, as far as we can see, and sort of a common root cause to both. And for some people, maybe they're a bit more sensitive to depression, so they don't need to have full-blown anxiety to get depressed. Or some people, maybe they have more resilience in the mood system, but they're still very vulnerable to the anxiety effects. So they have anxiety and no depression. But some people, you get one then the other, because obviously if the stress is causing the depression neurons to become sluggish, then anxiety causes more stress. So one begets the other, and so on and so on. So there's definitely seems to be a big overlap between the two.
And the combination's like the worst of all worlds.
Mm-hmm.
So we've moved on to the last question now. This is a nice one, other than the where is Pickle. I think Pickle showed his true colours, really, didn't he?
Yes, he does do that.
Karen asks, are you a fan of the film Inside Out and its message about the importance of sadness?
Yes, I love that film. I will say, that's not how emotions work, as far as we're aware. There's no sort of five. I know they're not little figures who run around in our heads, but distinct, clear emotions. It seems to be more nebulous than that. The brain actually has a more sort of vague and subtle approach to emotions, and that's we're writing a book about that right now. So that's kind of in the forefront of my mind. But yes, it does bring home I think I said earlier on, negative emotions are really important. We shouldn't suppress them. We shouldn't deny them. And that's believed to be why the things like people listen to sad music and they feel better. People listen to heavy metal, they feel less angry. Because our brain deals with negative experiences by processing them, and that involves re-experiencing them. like putting the record on and writing all the lyrics and stuff. So things like sad music, although it seems counterintuitive to say, well, why would you listen to makes you sad? Being sad is bad. But it helps you feel sadness in a completely controlled, safe environment where you're feeling connected to whoever's singing the music. You feel like you feel related to, you feel listened to, you feel understood, and you can turn it off whenever you want. It allows you to feel a negative emotion in a very safe, manageable, controlled context, which is what our brains really like, because they're not good. I got the benefits of it. It's like going to the gym. Like I got the workout. I didn't enjoy like 20 minutes of the treadmill, but it's my decision. I got to do it all, and I could leave whenever I wanted, and that's good. That's good exercise. So yeah, it's kind of like that. That's why it makes us feel better.
Should we be reading our children the original Grimm's fairy tales then, instead of the Disneyfied versions?
Maybe, I don't know. Well, I think there's some people say like, we should go back to that, but then they were changed in the first place because children tend to trust their parents. So the original fairy tales were like a lot of time they believed to be were means of controlling your children. Like behave or you'll be eaten and killed. Like, so okay, that's a bit much, So I'll say no. I think the Disney ones are fine.
Good. I did the Disney versions.
Yeah, definitely.
And we've actually, I said that was the last question. We've got one more. As Hans asks, what is the snowy picture behind you?
So Simon's Darling, Swedish. So basically, the Swedish artist who imposes sci-fi scenes onto scenes from his childhood in Sweden. There's a guy carrying like 80s era monitors with gargantuan flying spaceships in the background. It's very much my aesthetic,
That is so cool.
Very rural background with a massively embracing of science. So yeah, I'll go with it.
Well, thank you. That was fascinating and really informative, and I think actually helpful as well. So thank you so much for that.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me, everyone.
Thank you. Can I just also thank Kat for being available if either me or my internet ceased to function, and also for wrangling the questions, and also Laurie and Malcolm in the tech room. A reminder, we've got to talk about cosmology next week. And also that we've got the Lock-ins Razor, which links will be in the chat for the pub afterwards. So see you there. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you so much, Dean.
Well, thank you. Bye-bye.